was particularly important was that as you recall, there was, after 1967, the three no's after that the Arab League agreed to in Khartoum: no recognition, no negotiations, no peace with Israel. Well, here the PLO recognized, quote, the right of the state of Israel to exist in peace and security, and accepted UN Resolution 242 and renounced terrorism, which was critical for Israel. The charter of the PLO, which said that Israel is not, which denied Israel's existence and called for its overthrow, were now stated by the PLO as inoperative or no longer valid. Secondly, Israel, in return, recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole representative for the Palestinian people. A third piece of this is that this was going to be a transitional moment, right? The framework was the beginning, not the end. And that a big piece of this was a recognition that democracy was going to be critical to it. In particular, that Palestinians would elect their own government. First, they would elect an interim self-governing authority, PISCA, which I don't know why I like that term, but I just, PISCA, which would be elected and they'd be in office for, at the longest, 5 years, and that they would have to schedule elections for their government no later than July 13th of 1994. Okay, so this is critical. So this is not going to just be an imposed group. It's going to be somebody, the group of people.
We lost Scott.
Hopefully he'll come back on in just a moment. We have the worst internet. I'm so sorry. I feel so bad, everybody. He'll be back in just a moment.
He's back in. Don't have his audio yet, though.
No, it's our internet because I got kicked off. He's coming back.
He's here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, I'm just going to try to keep going here. Okay. Okay, that by the third year, right, there's this transition period of 5 years, and that they would go to negotiating a permanent status negotiations by the third year of that program. Now, here's the critical thing that I want to just sort of begin here today. The permanent status negotiations would have to start by the third year of this period of this transition government. Will address the following issues. What's going to happen with Jerusalem? Refugees, meaning Palestinian refugees, settlements, security, where the borders are going to be of any Palestinian country. And of course, that affects Israel's borders. How Palestine will relate to Jordan, Israel relate to Jordan, and other countries, and other issues of common interest, including Gaza, of course, and Egypt. So that's a mouthful, right? I mean, those are all the big issues. It was hard enough just to get to this moment where the Palestinians swore all terrorism and recognized Israel, and Israel recognized the Palestinians. And now they put all of the difficult issues on the table in order to, on the shelf in order to get to this. So right after this, Arafat and Rabin exchange a bunch of letters back and forth where they kind of start to cover some of these issues related to the PLO charter, renunciation of violence, things like that. And then now that this was concluded, right? I'm going to skip this analysis for a second. I'll come right back to it. You get to this, right? The next thing you got to is the signing of this Jordan-Israeli peace treaty. And this is a year later, but still, it's the King Hussein, Yitzhak Rabin, and of course, Bill Clinton presiding over this. But this is 2 years of negotiations, which started out in Madrid, which was the beginning of the Oslo Accords, essentially, because there was a whole set of negotiating. We'll talk a lot more about that tonight. And then this peace agreement, which, you know, Rabin, as I said last week, he was not too fond, in fact, hated Arafat and saw him as his arch enemy, but recognized the need to conclude an agreement. But King Hussein had a great affinity for, right? They were friends. And it was really kind of a denouement, if anything, this peace agreement, not to say that it wasn't incredibly significant and powerful. But when Jordan disengaged from the West Bank in 1988 and said, okay, we're going to allow the Palestinians to sort of, you know, with the Intifada and the outbreak of the Intifada, it became clear to the Jordanian government that there was a leadership in the West Bank, not Tunis, not in Tunisia, but that in the West Bank, there were indigenous, like Palestinians, who wanted to take control and lead their own liberation. And so at that point, it was already kind of clear that Jordan, which really wanted to have a better relationship with the West, always wanted to, including Israel, was going to be ready for this. But there was a lot of issues with the rest of the Arab world, as I hope the rest of the classes kind of made clear, that it wasn't, none of this occurs in a vacuum. And Jordan had relations with Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And, you know, so there was a lot of questions about how and when they would get to this agreement, but nobody doubted that in the West, in the United States, in Israel, in Jordan, that there was going to be some kind of an agreement at some point. So once the Palestinian issue seemed to be on a path to being resolved with the Declaration of Principles in 1993 in Oslo, it was quick to get to this agreement, this historic second major peace agreement that Israel concluded with one of its Arab neighbors, the first being in 1979 with Egypt. And this covered a lot of things, you know, their borders, water, how they would share the flow of the Jordan River, which is becoming ever more important these days. A pledge that they would never allow their own territory to be used by others to strike into the other side. And that's really a dig at the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had done that and had been doing it from Lebanon. Israel's commitment that the Islamic holy sites would be protected, and that essentially that Jordan would still retain control of those, was critical here. And then here's this commitment to address the issue of refugees, meaning Palestinian refugees. And in the meantime, to assist to relieve the suffering of those refugees and deal with displaced persons in Jordan, meaning Palestinians. So, and of course, all the good things that come with this: trade, sharing, tourism, energy. You can go to Petra easily, you can go to Amman easily, right? If you're coming through Israel, and you can go back and forth. agriculture, economic development, very important things. Now, I wanted to sort of look at these two mammoth important agreements and talk about the narratives. Now, the Israeli narrative is, let's start with the Intifada, the first Intifada we're talking about, okay? Uprising, which was that this was really a strategic, instrumental ploy to get public opinion on the side of the Palestinian people. That this wasn't just this organic uprising that came out of nowhere, that people were so fed up, but that it was actually a tactic to cultivate a David versus Goliath image that would persuade the rest of the public, right, meaning the Western public in particular, that that Israel was the perpetrator and oppressor, and that the Palestinians were facing a much larger foe, and down to the use of rocks, throwing of rocks, and using children to do this. Now, this is a distortion of reality, as the Palestinians were much more violent than was widely understood, and therefore it justified a disproportionate force. And this is again the Israeli narrative, right? That David versus Goliath image was not true, and that when Israel went in and used an iron fist, as Yitzhak Rabin said his reaction was going to be, that it was justified, that these protests were highly dangerous. Now, all of a sudden, Israel recognized that they had become in the center of the political map of the world, and that the Intifada was seen as a wake-up call. For a lot of Israelis, it became very apparent that sustaining the ongoing occupation of the West Bank was going to be costly, West Bank and Gaza, and that was going to continue to be costly, tremendously costly. So by 1991, when the Palestinian Liberation Organization accepted the two-state solution and began to negotiate in Madrid as part of the confederation with Jordan, that was seen by most Israelis as well, that there was some pragmatic leadership available, that the PLO had abandoned this all or nothing approach. And so two things, again, this was going to cost Israel if they continue the occupation, and it was not something they wanted to continue to do. And secondly, that there was somebody on the other side that they could talk to that was being practical. A second part of this narrative was that American support for Israel had a price tag. America defended Israel in the Gulf War against the Scud missiles, and it would continue to defend Israelis. At the same time, Israel had this huge job ahead of it of trying to incorporate more than 1 million new immigrants from Russia after the fall of the Iron Curtain. All of these refuseniks who were now able to leave were coming in, and Israel needed money from the United States. It needed loan guarantees, $10 billion in loan guarantees. And that meant that Israel had to do what it needed to do politically to retain close ties with the United States. Secretary of State James Baker had obtained Syria's agreement to go to Madrid. Israel knew that they were going to have to go too. If Syria was willing to go, then they were going to go. But the Bush administration, and this is Daddy Bush, in case for those of you who don't remember, really had come out pretty strongly against Israeli settlement building. I mean, Reagan had also come out against that too. And now Israel realized that they were going to have to comply if they were going to go here. Now, in terms of Oslo, the question is, why did this happen? How did they get this breakthrough? And it came from the Israeli perspective because of three things. One, the Palestinian side really had changed. First of all, the Intifada was not from Arafat. It wasn't from the old elite Palestinian Liberation Organization, the people who have been running terrorism in the 1970s. And this was a new group. This was a new group, and Arafat clearly was trying to respond to those populations, and that the West Bank Palestinians and the Gaza Strip Palestinians had become so distant from the Tunis-based PLO that this was something that the PLO better get ahead of, otherwise they were going to lose support. The Israelis understood this. They understood that that Arafat was going to be desperate to do something big and something different if he was going to stay in power. And a second and third thing is that, Arafat made a colossal mistake, and I'm reminded here of Hussein back during the Ottoman, during World War II, when he sided with Hitler. Not quite the same, but this idea like, oh, I'm gonna go and side with Saddam Hussein because I want the support of Iraq, and and I want these, so Arafat, in backing Saddam Hussein, made a terrible mistake, because obviously that was the losing side in this war. And it wasn't just a losing side internationally, it was also in the Arab world, that the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the more wealthier, moderate states sided with the United States. And here was Arafat sort of hung out there by himself. And he had to do something to get back into the good graces and get it back and to deal with that loss of authority on the international stage. And lastly, PLO had lost a huge amount of money. So it had to compromise. It needed money. It needed to end its armed struggle. It needed to accept an open-ended peace process. And that was critical. And a big part of this was, okay, so that's Israel's narrative, that Arafat was coming at it from a weak position and jumped at this opportunity, and they took advantage of this to negotiate a peace process, the beginning of a peace process, when the PLO's leadership was weak enough to see the pragmatic implications of that. Now, the second piece was, I think, Jordan. And as I said, this was not a big surprise. They already had kind of a de facto peace, if not an alliance. And they had shared interests in the region. And from Israel's perspective, the Jordanians, just like the Palestinians, saw the Palestinians as destabilizing to both of their interests. So Israel knew that Jordan wasn't going to make peace with them before Israel made peace with Syria, which they were trying to do first, which we'll talk about today, or at least if they made peace with the Palestinians. So when they signed the Oslo Accords, it was only a matter of time before they would come to the table. And this peace agreement had only upsides. There was no downsides in this for the Israel's position. And the fact that it was a second peace treaty with a major Arab country meant that the first one was now less exceptional, and that this could be a pattern. And finally, that Jordan could serve as a bridge with the wealthier Gulf states. It took until the Abraham Accords, that's a long time, but that was the idea that, that these Gulf states would see this, and, Israeli products could be marketed through Jordanian intermediaries and things like that. Okay, so what's the Palestine? I mean, none of this should feel mysterious to any of us, I think. Question is, how do the Palestinians see all this? First of all, is this Intifada. By 1987, Israel had basically a cost-free occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It was profitable for them, right? The settlements were being built with very cheap housing on confiscated Palestinian land. Precious water resources were being diverted for Israeli use, while the Palestinians were denied their fair share. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, these were incredibly attractive tourism, holy places, led to a lot of revenues. There's a lot of cheap labor available from Gaza. Palestinians paid taxes and various fees for work permits. So for the Israelis, according to the Palestinian narrative, the Intifada was a way to show the Israelis that there was going to be a cost if this occupation continued. It was a way to send them a message. Israel was way too powerful militarily, so it had to be relatively nonviolent. To neutralize Israel's military superiority, they realized this Intifada was never going to be an existential threat to Israel, but that rather it would be a prod to compel Israel to negotiate and ultimately, hopefully, to give up the occupation. The fact is that it worked. A few years after the Intifada was launched, Israel was at the negotiating table with the PLO. First in Madrid, the Madrid process with 35 other countries, right? And then in the track 2 negotiations in Oslo directly. Now, there was also a weakness that the Palestinians recognized in their own PLO. When the PLO had to leave Lebanon in '82 because of Israel's invasion, by the way, the armed confrontation with Israel diminished. And Palestinian state-like institutions in education and health, housing had to be created. They had to be built to replace those of the Israeli occupation. And so this was back in the 1930s when the British mandate was in place. There was an effort from the Jewish side of things to build proto-state institutions, to create governing institutions, schools and legislatures, military, defense, right? The Palestinians never did that. And that was one of their huge problems all these many years. Now, they were starting to do that. They were starting to build these things. While the PLO was basically paralyzed, Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza were doing these things. Now, the PLO started to get worried when they saw that the Jordanians were starting to think about how they might restore its standing in the West Bank. And the Intifada was also a way to send a message to the Jordanians about their own sense of national identity, that Jordan really was not going to run the occupied territories, that they were going to run it. And so when Jordan disengaged in 1988 from the West Bank, the Palestinians were very happy about this. That was seen as one of their great achievements, ending Jordan's ambitions on the West Bank. Now, the two-state solution, the PLO finally, after almost 50 years, was endorsing UN Resolution 181 and 242. They were accepting the idea that they were not going to get all of Israel and everything that was there before, but that they were going to actually have to accept some of the land, and that the Israelis were going to retain the other parts. And so when they issued their own Declaration of Independence, and they said, our country will have its capital in East Jerusalem and will consist of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, that was viewed by most Palestinians as a major set of concessions. But rather than being a sign of defeat for their right, they saw this as a pragmatic decision. This was a culmination of a process that started way back not way back, but as early as 1974, after the 73 war, when it became clear that the idea of the Arab nations liberating all of Palestine for the Palestinians was really unrealistic. And particularly after 1979, when Egypt signed a peace deal, that really injected a sense of realism into their sense of how they were going to handle Israel. So the nationalists who were in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Gaza, were taking over Palestinian politics. That's Husseini and Ashram and Saeb Erekat. So these folks, Arafat's Tunis-backed leadership was a partner. They provided guidance, they provided financial support, but the nationalists were the key. Now, another piece of this that's really important is that there were Islamists for the first time that were involved here, from Hamas and Islamic Jihad that came out of this Intifada. They started to become very, very, very important here as well. So you had three different groups. You had the nationalist leadership, you had the Palestinian Islamic activists, and you had the old school Tunis-based PLO leadership. Now, when they got to Madrid, that was not a real good process for the Palestinians. First of all, the PLO didn't have a direct voice there. They could not go there except as part of a federation with Jordan. And it never addressed the issue of Palestinian statehood at all. But it also brought back the idea that Jordan was going to be a major player in Palestinian affairs when they didn't even want that. That's not where they wanted to go. Now, the Palestinian nationalists in the West Bank and Gaza saw this and they said, look what the PLO is doing. They're going to Spain to talk with the rest of the world about everybody else's issues except ours. And they're doing it not even as a self-identified Palestinian leadership, but rather as part of the Jordanians. So that was an issue for them. And they felt that the defects in this Palestinian, in this Madrid process reflected their weakness in the Arab world, in international world. And that was brought home in particular because of Arafat's decision to side with Saddam Hussein. So the majority of the Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza thought that the Oslo Accords were a good thing. They were hopeful that this could lead to somehow ending the occupation. Most of them felt like the Intifada was so powerful that they could have gotten a better deal. And the most important thing that they didn't see in the Declaration of Principles was there was no specific promise that this would lead to a Palestinian nation. And it also, by the way, didn't say anything about ending settlement activities. The other thing was it didn't really address the problem of East Jerusalem, and it didn't address the Palestinian population in the millions outside of the Palestinian Authority Oslo, at some level, even though most people endorsed it, was seen as being a big victory for the Israelis. They got all they wanted, and the Palestinian needs were all put off on the shelf that they would deal with later. But they understood this was an interim measure and that it was part of an open-ended process that was kind of similar to the disengagement agreements that Israel had signed with Egypt and Syria after the 73 war. The Jordanian peace agreement seemed like a side agreement to them that really didn't address any of their issues either. And they also saw those references to the Jordan having control over the holy places in Jerusalem as an affront, because that was East Jerusalem, that was going to be where their capital would be. So you can see here that the Palestinians and the Israelis had some overlap in understanding the imperfections of the Oslo Accord, that they understood it as a starting place. But the Palestinians felt more desperate, in my view, to do something, even though they felt like on one foot they got off, they had demonstrated their strength with this Intifada. On the other hand, they had no other choice but to actually start to conclude some kind of an agreement. Okay, so how did this happen? Where did this occur? I mean, what explains the first Intifada? What explains the why the PLO decided to turn toward diplomacy? And I kind of got to some of these things already, but these are some interesting questions. Why were the Israeli and Arab nations willing to go to Madrid to start talking about peace at this point in time? And how do we get these two very important peace agreements, essentially? So there's two categories to try to begin to explain this. For sure, these are milestones in the Palestinian-Israeli realm. The first Intifada, the PLO's Declaration of Independence and its acceptance of U.S. conditions for their U.S. PLO dialogue in 1993 Accords. And then there were another, this second set of issues was successes with the 1991 Madrid negotiations and the 1994 Jordan-Israeli peace treaty. So in terms of the systemic factors, I think, you can't discount the fact that the Soviet Union was no more. Without the Soviet Union, the United States' power in the Middle East was so much bigger, right? And the other thing was the Arab nations, without the Soviets, were becoming more and more dependent on the United States, and had other issues to concern themselves with other than the Palestinians. The Palestinians started to realize that they had become almost irrelevant in the Arab world, right? The Iran-Iraq war was gigantic. Then the Persian Gulf War with the United States and world attention to that. So the Palestinian concerns were getting pushed off the agenda, and their leadership wasn't even close to them. They were all the way out in Tunis since 1982, and they had lost touch with the day-to-day lives and the people who were in Palestine, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Gaza. Therefore, they're no longer in a position to threaten regional stability in a way that would affect the interests of the international community, which focused on the Gulf. If the international community would not be woken up by the Palestinians themselves, they would slip into permanent indifference to the Palestinians, if not amnesia, regarding everything Palestinian. So, and that was true at the systemic regional level too. So they decided they would take things into their own hands. And recall that there's this internal political struggle between the leadership in Tunis and the nationalists' leadership in the West Bank, and the growing, very important but not yet powerful, growing influence of the Islamists, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. So there's this split, and so the PLO is feeling this tension, and they realize they have to do something, as I said. And Israel, there's another side of things, right? The Shamir government was really, Yitzhak Shamir, Likud prime minister, was really not gearing. He didn't think anything had to be done to change the occupation. Maybe something cosmetic, but Shamir really was very, very reluctant to do any kind of negotiations with Yasser Arafat or any Palestinian. And so when the Israeli people started to feel the costs of the occupation because of the Intifada, there was an election and they elected a labor government. And Yitzhak Rabin, which was, by the way, former, defense minister, the architect of the response to the Intifada, the Iron Fist response. I mean, he was no softy. I mean, this is a guy who was a hawk all his life and a military man. But in a way, only because he was that way would the Israeli people trust that he could negotiate and still protect the security of the Israelis. So these internal factors that really changed, right? The PLO's need to sort of get out in front of this leadership competition, and Rabin, the shift of this government to Yitzhak Rabin. And let's not forget that, Clinton replaced George H.W. Bush. And Clinton was much more friendly to the idea of negotiating a peace agreement. He had already been successful early on in his presidency in Ireland. And so this was sort of his modus operandi. And Secretary of State James Baker, who had been just absolutely instrumental in getting Syria to the bargaining table in Madrid, was not seen by the Israelis as a friendly face. He was seen as somebody who would not be favorable, right? And therefore Bush would not be favorable to the Israeli position, whereas Warren Christopher, seen as kind of like a no man, like not insignificant. It was Clinton that was significant at this point. And Clinton seemed sympathetic to the Israeli position and connected to Yitzhak Rabin. So in that environment, the Palestinians took things into their own hands, declared this Declaration of Independence. Yet Oslo was no less the product of a number of factors that had, there was a number of things that got in the way of anything occurring at Madrid, right? So, especially on the Israeli-Palestinian front, they could get the Likud government to go, but they couldn't get over the problem of having the Jordanians stand in with the Palestinians. And once Bush was out of the picture because the Madrid had started and then he lost the election, now there was this opportunity for Clinton to try to take ownership of this and to create this back channel negotiation. At the most unit level, right? There was a lot of important social changes for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, as I've mentioned already, all of which produced this growing pressure. Just a couple of things I want to say about this. A lot of the people who had who were like young people who had been born after 1967 in the West Bank had now come of age. And the youth were also a little bit better off financially than the previous generation. They had they were less financially dependent than their elders, and they could assert themselves and defy their society's traditional leaders and start to take matters into their own hands. So, so when Faisal Husseini and Hana Ashrari and Saeed Erekat were these young Western style, here, I think I have a picture in this. Let's go back to that picture, sorry. So when these guys sort of emerged as the face of the Palestinian leadership, it wasn't just that they were younger and more westernized. They also had access to a new form of media, Al Jazeera and CNN. They could speak to not just the people in Palestine who had been born since '67, right? And were looking for something a little bit more pragmatic and a little more practical that could better their lives now, not this like, we're going to overthrow Israel, when it became clear that that wasn't going to happen. And so these folks became the challenge to Arafat's leadership. So Arafat had to do something big, right? And that's when, the Declaration of Independence came, and Arafat's all of a sudden switched on a dime and now becomes pragmatic. He wants to recognize, renounce terrorism. He wants to recognize Israel. This is the big change. So the other thing I want to say
But
about
why you wanted to renounce violence?
What's that?
Why did Arafat want to renounce violence?
Oh, for public consumption. He felt that this
Because
would be the only
Americans
way that he could get
insisted.
back that Clinton would that Reagan first and then Clinton would accept them as negotiating partners.
Because the Americans insisted.
Right.
Otherwise, they would not talk to them.
They wouldn't even talk to them. Exactly. So, but it was a pragmatic move. I mean, in the past, they'd say, I don't care. I'm speaking to my people. But now all of a sudden they realized they needed to speak as well to the Americans, and that was critical. So one other thing I want to say about all of this was that, for the Palestinians here, there was this, and for the rest of the world, in the conclusion of the 1993 Declaration of Principles, there was this recognition that the same strategy that seemed like Sadat had adopted, a violent action, a war, and then and before that, wars of smaller wars with Israel, followed up by negotiations with Israel, produced a peace. Now it looked like that was the same thing that was happening with Jordan. That looked like the same thing that was happening in some level with the Palestinians. And it seemed that the Egyptian approach that they had been so castigated for, thrown out of the Arab League, Sadat was assassinated, now all of a sudden seemed to be gaining currency in the Arab world, or potentially. So let me take a minute break, because I left all my notes upstairs when we had all these, for my second part of my lecture, when we had this technical problem. So hang on one second. Talk amongst yourselves.
Not a lot of talking. Oh. Oh. Awesome.
All right. So I want to take us through what happened since that time. And I think I have that here. So there were two key things that happened before Oslo II. A series of efforts to negotiate a peace between Israel and Syria, and post-Madrid multilateral efforts to address big Middle East regional issues. So I want to just highlight a couple of important, this sets the stage for what I want to talk about next time I see you guys. I think it'll be next week. When we talk about the Oslo II and the Second Intifada and the falling apart of all this, which is just tragic. So, this period is the first time when we're really entering when the United States is the only remaining superpower. A second piece of this is that the EU, the UN, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, there's this movement towards global finance, globalization, global governance, which is really important in terms of how it affects the Middle East politics. And in this period of time, we have 4 different Israeli governments, headed first by Prime Minister Rabin. After his assassination, Shimon Peres. He's defeated by Netanyahu, the first time Netanyahu was prime minister, who's then in for a very short one term, and then Ehud Barak. And all 4 of these guys are trying to find a peace deal with Assad of Syria, and they all fall apart. And it's really interesting how this occurs, and it affects how we, I think, understand what happens with Palestinians as well. So Shamir, right after the Madrid conference, sort of went into this to try to establish some kind of peace after the, in the aftermath of Madrid conference. And then we'll talk a little bit about these multilateral talks. Now, another piece that's really important in this period is the sharp rise in political Islam and Islamic terrorism in the Middle East, which is going to come back to bite in Israel and its efforts to try to negotiate a peace with the Palestinians as well. So let's see here. I'm skipping a few things, that's why. Like here. So I should just say this. In 1992, Clinton wins the presidency. Israeli elections result in a a Labor Party victory, and Yitzhak Rabin becomes the prime minister. And prior to that, Israel had accused Assad of being anti-Israel, of inciting anti-Semitic, with anti-Semitism in their school textbooks and their media. And so that was all happening. I'm not saying that wasn't real, but that was sort of the relationship between Syria and Israel had reached kind of a low point. And here's Rabin coming into office, and he opens up this indirect line of communication with Syrian President Hafez al-Assad that the United States is facilitating. It starts with the ambassador from the United States, Walid al-Mulam, and then Israel's ambassador Itamar Rabinovich, and they agree that they want to focus on three major issues: peace between Israel and Syria, territory, and security. Now you can see sort of like a little bit of Assad's biography. He's president forever, 30 years. He's blamed for the loss of Syria's loss in 1967. And then he still gets somehow into power as the prime minister and then president. He, along with Nasser, launched the attack on Yom Kippur on Israel in 1973. And during the Lebanon civil war, puts Syrian troops in Lebanon, and they stay there, right? Syria's got a big, huge presence in Lebanon, which is important for us to recognize. Now, after the 91 Madrid conference, he starts to enter in these negotiations with each of these prime ministers until his death in 2000, which is, but nothing happens, right? So just to highlight, this is the issue, right? This is the Golan Heights. You can see water's going to be important here, right? It's hard to see the fact that this is, it's called the Golan Heights. So just realize, like, it snows up there, right? So this is way higher. And anyone who knows anything about military knows that that's an advantage militarily, to have the high ground, right? And Israel captured, a lot of this land in the 1967 war, and held on to it. And so the big issue is with Syria is, first of all, Syria has been hostile to Israel from the very start and before, as we've said from time to time. So peace. What's going to happen to this Golan Heights? And if Israel does give back the Golan Heights or some piece of it, how will they guarantee their own security? Okay, so those are the big things. So in 92, going back a year before this, Hamas killed several soldiers and border policemen in Gaza in December of 1992. And Yitzhak Rabin expels 400 Islamic jihad activists and Hamas activists from the West Bank and from Gaza. And any talks that they were going to have, Rabin and Assad, go away. That's gone. They resume in April of 93, but it never really works out. There's more violence, this time from Hezbollah, and now Israel attacks up into Lebanon. Meanwhile, Syria says, look, if we're going to negotiate, you've got to promise us that you're going to get out of Golan. You're going to give us a full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. And in 1993, Yitzhak Rabin goes to the brand new Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, and quietly said that he articulates a hypothetical willingness of the Israelis to withdraw from the Golan Heights if Syria agrees to peace on terms acceptable to Israel. And what Rabin said to Christopher was, this has to be secret. I don't want you to put this on the table. But Christopher went ahead and told Assad that this was the deal. And Rabin really didn't like what Syria told Christopher in return. And he said, okay, you know what? We're not going to get a deal with Syria, which is what he wanted to do first and foremost. And then he switches gears and he goes, we're going to focus on the PLO negotiations and the Declaration of Principles that we just talked about. Now, Syria was surprised by that. This was all secret. Remember, the Oslo negotiations were secret. So right after Oslo, this was the focus of Israel. But in 1994, President Clinton goes back to Assad and says, look, we want to get these talks back on track. We want to get a Syria-Israeli peace agreement. And so they start again. But then Assad's oldest son dies in a traffic accident. That's who his successor is going to be. And Baruch Goldstein does this heinous crime in Hebron where he shoots all these poor innocent Palestinians to death while they're praying in Hebron. And this ends. Everything's over, right? So everything outside of this, these negotiations with Assad, but nothing to do with the actual negotiations, but it just kind of makes it impossible. Meanwhile, Israel brings negotiations with Jordan to a very successful conclusion. And here they are signing the peace agreement at Wadi Arava with Clinton presiding. And Clinton, after he's there, he says, let's take a stop in Syria. And he goes back to Syria and he says, look, we still want to work on that Israeli-Syrian peace agreement. Rabin is still committed. So Syria's general and Israel's general Ehud Barak, that name should sound familiar because he goes on to become a prime minister. In December 1994 and in May of 1995, they get down, they negotiate a draft agreement and they approve it in May of 1995, an agreement for Syria-Israeli peace. And they have some more talks at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., and they come up with a 17-page agreement. And then Netanyahu gets a hold of it and leaks it out to the public as a way to criticize the Rabin government in a campaign. And kind of blows it out of the water. It's very sensitive, and then when it gets out to the public, it's not going to work. Now, in November, before this attack up in Lebanon, there's this tragic assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in Tel Aviv by Yigal Amir, right-wing Israeli opponent of peace. Shimon Peres gets into office and he is willing to continue to talk to Assad about peace. On the day of Rabin's funeral, Clinton asks Peres if he'd abide by the commitments that Rabin had made to Syria. That Rabin had made a quote unquote deposit, a commitment, a verbal one. And Perez sent a letter to Assad affirming that he would continue to pursue comprehensive peace agreement with Syria. And so Dennis Ross, Clinton's peace negotiator from the Middle East, held a bunch of meetings at the Wye River Conference Center here near Washington, D.C., between Israel and Syria. And then after that, Secretary of State Warren Christopher went to Jerusalem and to Damascus. They start to negotiate, and this ends in a stalemate because Syria says, we want a buffer zone. Let me go back to the map. We want a buffer zone right in here. And we want your troops to go here, right? And so Israel says, we want you guys to go all the way back here, but we want to stay right up against the border because we're so vulnerable. And Syria says no. Another problem that they had is issues of water. When Israel signed a defense agreement with Turkey, Syria thought that this was a threat to them because Syrian Turkish relationships were not so good. And it also threatened the issues about water because once Israel resolved its conflicts with Turkey, there would be no problem guaranteeing Israel a supply of water. So they get into a third round of talks, and then Syria refuses to condemn 2 suicide attacks in Jerusalem in early March, and then another one in Tel Aviv on March the 4th. And Perez said they're going to suspend their talks. And then there's an anti-terrorism conference that Clinton convenes, and Syria refuses to go, even though Egypt's there. Hezbollah starts to attack Israel from southern Lebanon, and on April 2nd, 1996, Israel launches the Operation Grapes of Wrath, a major incursion into southern Lebanon to deal with Hezbollah. And the UN called for a ceasefire, but after the ceasefire, Israeli artillery shelled a UN base near Qana that same day, and over 100 Lebanese civilians who had gone to the base for refuge were killed. Israel says, we didn't mean to do that, it was an error, but international opinion really turns against Israel, and the Syrian negotiations are over. And then Netanyahu wins. In 1996, Israel held its very first ever prime minister's election, having changed its election laws, and it still had parliamentary elections, but they also had an independent election for the prime minister. And Perez lost to Netanyahu. And Netanyahu decides he's going to do this negotiation with Syria. And now Netanyahu wanted to make sure that Warren Christopher did not see that Shimon Peres's and Yitzhak Rabin's previous commitments about Golan Heights, that those were binding. He did not want to feel that those were binding. But pretty much nothing else happened. And so then, this is so fascinating to me. Netanyahu asks Ronald Lauder, the American billionaire, former ambassador to Austria, to approach Assad and to start talking secretly about negotiating a peace agreement. Lauder basically said, look, according to Clinton, Lauder told Clinton that Assad had agreed to accept Israeli withdrawal to international borders, and much less severe than the 1967 international borders. But Netanyahu wouldn't show the map where Israel's line of withdrawal would be. And so a lot of people said the latter talks were pretty successful. We just don't know. And then, you know, Ehud Barak gets elected. I mean, Netanyahu's in power for just 4 years, and then Ehud Barak comes in, and Barak promises that he's going to get out of southern Lebanon in the framework of an agreement with Syria. That's his campaign promise, and that's a big deal. So here he is with Assad, not Assad, but the foreign minister from Syria, and Clinton and Ehud Barak agreeing to resume Israeli-Syrian peace negotiations yet again. It's amazing that this guy Assad continues to negotiate. And so they get in there, and this is Farouk Sha'ara. And Shepherdstown, West Virginia, they have these more detailed negotiations, and they have 4 committees, one on the borders and how they're going to get out of, you know, Golan. Second thing is water. A third is how we normalize relations between Syria and Israel. And the last is security. So there's 4 different issues. The normalization committee and the security committees got down to business right away. The other 2 kind of held informal talks they didn't release. So the water committee and withdrawal committee, which is the key one, right? How are you going to get out of the Golan Heights? That really never start. And Clinton really gets involved. He has had it. He thinks, maybe if I personally get involved, and he tries to do that. And the United States presents Israel and Syria with a proposed agreement. And Clinton meets with Assad himself in Geneva in the year 2000. He gives this whole detailed map that of Ehud Barak's promise of withdrawing based on these 1967 lines, with some adjustments around a Syrian fishing village on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Let me go back to the map. Right, so there's this little area that Ehud Barak says, we're going to draw this line a little bit over here. But other than that, you can have all of this is the lines pre-1967. Assad, when Clinton takes that to Assad, Assad barely lets him get it, start talking, and says, no way. Barak is in
Can I say
serious.
a word, please?
Yeah, let me just finish what I'm going to say. He says, Barak isn't serious. I'm not going to listen. That's it. It's over. Yes, go ahead. That's all I want to say.
Actually, the discussion and the reason for which this negotiation with the CN failed is actually shown on the map as what it's called the 10-meter strip.
Yeah. Oh, it's up here. Yeah.
Yes, you see that?
It's even smaller.
And
Yeah.
the Israelis insisted, this is the crucial point for which the negotiation failed. The Israelis insisted, in order not to allow the Syrian any access to the Sea of Galilee, that there'll be a strip not to the water, that area, the Golan Heights, the Syrian border will not go all the way to the water, which will give them access to the Sea of Galilee and another way of harassing the Israeli fishing and other activities in the lake. And therefore, they insisted 10 meters away from it. And when the Syrians did not allow for it, that's how it collapsed.
Oh my gosh. So, yeah. So, I mean, Michael, but yeah, this is, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but like from Ehud Barak's perspective, you don't negotiate with someone by telling them exactly what you're going to do. You start with your hardest sell. And this was what he expected that the Syrians might negotiate back. But instead, they just walked away from negotiations completely and said, oh, Ehud Barak isn't serious about having a peace deal, which was, that ended, it completely ended the whole thing. But I wanted to point out all of this effort by the Clinton administration, by the Likud prime ministers, by the Labor prime ministers, to try to secure this peace with Syria as a critical piece to getting the entire context of the Arab-Israeli conflicts to change. The PLO negotiation, the Declaration of Principles, was to, from the perspective of Israel, and was going to be successful, but only if other parts of the context of the entire relationship could change. And this was one of them. You know, the Jordanian agreement, the Egyptian agreement were pieces of this. But you could argue that one of the reasons why Oslo framework doesn't really ever succeed is this ultimate failure to get a peace agreement with Assad. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason. I'm just saying that's a big piece of it, and that's why I wanted to go through it. The other piece that I wanted to sort of heighten here for us is this multilateral working group. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because we're almost done. But they start back, I'm going back to 1991 again. And there's this set of, the issues that affect the entire Middle East region. So too often we talk about the Israelis and the Palestinians as if they don't live in the Middle East, as if they're separate from the rest of the politics there, right? So I hopefully you get one of the things you get from my class is how important it is to see this as part of a broader context of Middle East politics and world politics for that matter. After the Madrid conference goes away, right? In 1992, starting in Moscow, there are 35 different Arab states that get involved, 35 states, excuse me, including 13 Arab states, including Israel, including the Palestinians. Iraq and Iran were not invited. Syria and Lebanon said they weren't going to come until Israel made more progress in terms of reaching peace with them. But the rest of them, they create these 5 working groups, and they focus on water, the refugees, economic cooperation, the environment, and arms control. Let's start with this last one, the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group. Started in May of 1992. And Israel and Egypt were the key players here. Egypt wanted to use this group to stop nuclear proliferation. And Israel wanted to start with focusing on levels of distrust and conventional weapons. So from September of 92 to May of 1993, Israel and Jordan are trying to get this talk going. And the Mubarak comes in, Hosni Mubarak, president of Egypt, and he proposes a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone. And Perez looks at this and he says, look, I understand you want to focus on weapons of mass destruction, but before that, we need to deal with getting a stable and durable peace. And otherwise, we can't have any kind of mutual verification of any kind of, imaginary, no, we're not going to have any weapons of mass destruction. On the concept of peace, they could get all the way, except they could not agree on the nuclear issue. And that is, they keep going, and they meet us a bunch of times, and they ultimately can't get past a disagreement between Israeli and the Egyptians. Egypt says, we want Israel to sign that they will join the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And Israel says, no, that's our major deterrent. And we'll talk about conventional weapons, we'll talk about other kinds of agreements and mutual assurances and all those kinds of things. We'll talk about confidence and security building measures. We'll exchange military information. They had all of these negotiations, but Egypt would not step away from the nuclear issue, and Israel wouldn't engage on that, not on that issue. And so this just falls apart. On the water and environmental working groups, Japan is chairing this one, and they're trying to address all sorts of water issues, pollution, wastewater treatment, environmental management, desertification, right? In their 7th meeting in Amman in 1995, they create this multilateral working group on water resources with a regional effort to focus on desalinization. And of course, Israel's, got the expertise here. Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority also agree on a declaration of principles for cooperating on water. This is one of those areas where they can make some headway, but the lack of progress on arms negotiation make it very difficult to make any further progress on water, and it kind of falls apart as well. On refugees, this is a really critical issue. It starts in Canada, the refugee working group, and they're talking about a lot of different issues, but the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the Palestinian refugees, is left off the table. That, they agree, is only going to be dealt with between Israel and Palestinians in accordance with the Declaration of Principles just signed in '93 in Oslo. So that kind of makes the whole rest of it kind of less and less important. So I don't want to talk about the rest of this, but I just want to highlight these 2 things. Let me just say a couple things here, and then we'll end. From Israel's perspective on Syria, Rabin felt like he had gone further than any other Israeli leader in terms of being willing to extend the hand to Assad, but only in exchange for a real peace. And he said, the depth of Israel's withdrawal will reflect the depth of peace that Syria would offer Israel. I don't want, said Rabin, I don't just want lip service. I don't want you just we don't want to just have your embassy is going to be open and our embassy is going to be open and we're going to sign a letter and that's it. We want real peace. We want you got, and this is, and the failure, says Rabin, is completely Assad's. He says all this window dressing, but he's not really willing to talk about committing his country to stopping this incredible hostility they've always had towards Israel. And we're not going to get out of the Golan unless that happens. More importantly, from Rabin's perspective, Assad, unlike Sadat, never came to Israel and wouldn't talk to the Israeli public. I mean, Rabin knew this was going to be hard as hell for him to sell to his public as a labor leader, even with his credentials as a military guy, that they were going to get out of the Golan Heights. And he needed Assad to come and reassure people, but Assad was not Sadat. And he wasn't, right? He wasn't a guy who did big dramatic things. And he was uptight. He wasn't warm and charismatic like King Hussein. There was no relationship for the Israeli people with Hafez Assad. And this doomed it, right? So that's how the Israelis see this. When Perez said he would follow up on this, he even made it a priority over PLO negotiation. Again, Syria wouldn't directly negotiate with Israel. They wouldn't stop the terror attacks from Hezbollah from South Lebanon. They wouldn't agree on reasonable security measures that recognize Israel's vulnerability. And even when Ehud Barak got in there and made very significant progress, the domestic challenges that he faced at home made it so that he had to have that initial offer that was going to be a little harder line. And then Syria just completely rejected it. So from the Israelis' perspective on Syria, They did everything they could to actually get out of Golan Heights, and do a real deal with Assad. And Assad was like not willing to look for the solution. I'm going to skip the multilateral talks for a second. From the Palestinian perspective on Syria, they were freaking out. If Syria actually did have a peace agreement with Israel, the third country, that would leave the Palestinians the last ones to negotiate peace. No leverage whatsoever at all. And they would, this was not good, right? As far as all those multilateral talks were, that all seemed like the rest of the Arab world was normalizing relationships with Israel, and that Israel was getting the upper hand in international public opinion as a result, and that the Palestinians were becoming less and less, they're entering into a place where they were going to have a harder and harder time to negotiate with Israel. All of this is important because it helps explain what happens with the Oslo Accords after this period of time, including the eruption of the Second Intifada. Although I'm not excusing it, I'm just saying this is part of that context that really helps us understand what's happened. I did want to talk a minute about Egypt, because one of the things that you'll see with, I'll end with this, is that, you know, most of the multilateral talks failed, in particular because of the unwillingness of Egypt. A lot of the Arab countries looked at Egypt and said, you're holding this whole thing hostage to your pet peeve about Israel having to renounce its nuclear power, its nuclear arms. And that's not going to happen. We know that. Let's get on with the business of dealing with water and trade and all these other things that they want to deal with. And Egypt's like, no, no, no. It's all about Israel's not willing to sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which they weren't going to do, right? This is the last chance from Egypt's perspective, because the NPT extension deadline was in 1995. And this was the time they wanted to get Israel to back out of nuclear arms. From Israel's perspective, look, we see our nuclear weapon as a deterrent. It's not we're not an aggressor. We've been attacked several times. We hold on to this. We're not going to use it. And if we're talking about Syrian peace with Syria, if Syria is going to take the Golan Heights back, all the more reason we need to have a deterrent rather than a conventional weapon superiority to prevent any attacks from Arab countries using the Golan Heights or any other place. From Egypt's perspective, though, Israel's nuclear capacity seemed like a way that Israel could have cover, that they could be aggressive on every other front because they had the nuclear bomb and nobody else did. Egypt also said this movement for Israel to get peace with Jordan and Palestine seemed like a big threat to their power in the region. So here's Egypt at these multilateral talks saying, no, we're going to be the big man on campus, and we're going to say, we're going to take Israel's nuclear bomb away from them, which of course that wasn't going to happen. But Egypt, Mubarak really wants to sort of reassert his preeminence in the Arab world on this issue, which basically collapses those multilateral talks. All right, so I don't have time to get into the rest of this, but I did want to show you the view from the Golan Heights at the end here. There's so many other beautiful ones, but this gives you a sense of how high up it is, and it's how important it has been. Okay.
I have a question.
Please.
Can you send some the slides?
Yes, I can send all
Okay.
those slides. I sent the last 2 sets.
Oh, okay. I'll have to look
yeah.
for it then. I don't
But
know
if not, I'm happy to send more of them to you.
Yeah, because then I can kind of review it again. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I went through a lot of stuff, but
Oh,
bottom
no,
line
I
is
don't.
that, yeah, there was a lot of negotiations with Assad between Israel, ultimately coming very close to almost getting peace, but never quite getting there. And then there was this effort, I didn't say it this way, effort to integrate Israel into a Middle East role with many other countries on these other issues about water and environment and trade and things like that, which sends a message of a lot of hope at this point. Yes, Michael, please.
I don't want to monopolize the time. If somebody else has something to say, should go before me.
Why? Do you have a big speech to make?
No, I have my own comments as usual, but
Okay.
I had complaints before that I am talking, taking over the place.
Oh, I'm just kidding with you, Michael. Go ahead, please.
I
Oh,
have a comment. Wait,
Oh,
wait.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to thank you, Scott, for really summarizing this very difficult subject. I mean, I need to kind of go over it numerous times to even get it in my head, but thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Debbie. Yeah. My pleasure. Go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry.
Your turn, Michael.
I want you to talk. Oh, now he's quiet. Okay.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to sign off. Is there anything else we're hearing? Just send me
No.
those.
Next week, I'm going to talk about the negotiation of the critical issues that were set out in the Declaration of Principles, Jerusalem, and all the other things that
Declaration of
Yeah.
Principles. That's what I was looking
at the
for.
1993 Declaration of Principles. That's yeah.
All right.
That
Thank
is my
you.
turn.
Oh, now you're back on. Okay. I
Sorry.
didn't mean to scare you away. I thought maybe-
I didn't want to take over. All right.
No, go ahead,
First
please.
of all, Scott, and I am, with all due respect, because I don't want this to become an issue of contention between us. You have stated several times that Israel confiscated Arab lands, okay, as if this was an accepted truth. It is not true. Unless you provide, okay, some examples and not tell me, oh, one author said that's what they did. You have to provide examples. If there's no example like that, it never happened.
Okay, Michael, I just let me be clear. When I was talking about that, I was talking about practices of settlement building in the West Bank.
Yeah, this is not their land. It is not a Palestinian land. It's the Jewish land as just as much. Do you
Okay.
understand? The Jews took the opportunity and placed some settlers in there, but it doesn't mean they took it from anybody. It was a land, as a matter of fact, at that point, it was the land of the Jews because the Jews captured it and Jordan gave it up.
So, Michael, that is a one particular perspective on it, and that is not the only perspective.
Of course it is not. But the point is that when you claim that Jews confiscated land from Palestinians, it's not true because it was not theirs.
Okay, but I think it's true. So I'm giving you a different.
No, I don't mind that you have such opinion, but as an academic
Not an opinion.
presenting that
it's
story to the class, you have to provide some examples to sustain your position. That's all.
I can provide specific
some
examples.
examples.
Can you?
I can
You
provide
provide some
specific
examples.
examples.
Okay, please give me.
There's another hand up.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah,
So
Ira.
this
You
is
may
one
have
thing.
some-
Jewish
may have
Collaborative of
some
Orange
help on
County,
that.
you can talk. Go ahead.
Okay, I have a couple more points to make.
Okay, but wait a second, because I'll come back to you for the next one. Go
Okay.
ahead, Jewish Collaborative of Orange County. You have to unmute yourself. Oh, you froze. Uh-oh. You froze. Okay, Michael, go ahead. Second.
Okay. The second point is, at one point you asserted that the Palestinians decided that they will be the ones we are going to, the Jordanians realize that the Palestinians will be representing their cause, okay? And it was their decision. Actually, this was not a Jordanian decision. It was the Khartoum and the Arab League decision, okay, to impose on Jordan to give up its claim to the West Bank. That's how it started. Not because Jordan or the PLO all of a sudden kind of came to this realization and they want to do that.
I'm not sure which time you're talking about. Are you talking about 1988?
At any time, the Jordanian simply could not have any dealings in the West Bank because it was the decision of the Arab League to hand over the Palestinian.
Well, the Jordanians left the West Bank in 1988, and they said that they were no longer going to be interested in trying to deal with the West Bank. So that was a disengagement. But it wasn't because they were forced to.
Of the Arab League.
No, there was no Arab League vote to have Jordan do that. Jordan
That
unilaterally
was
did
the
it.
standing decision of the Arab League after the '67 war.
Okay, but now it's 1988. So
Exactly.
Jordan decided to do it finally.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay.
But they
And-
weren't forced to do it because of that, because they didn't do it all this time.
Okay, the other thing is I want to tell you, I happened to be in a coffee shop about a week ago, Sunday. And I don't know how it happened, but I said something to the guy sitting next to me. He had a kid. He's about 30 years old with his wife, and the kid was doing something. So I made a comment, and the guy turned to me and he answered me. And then a few minutes later, he said, "Let me ask you a question, if I may. I don't want you to check it the wrong way. Are you Israeli or French?" I said, "I'm Israeli." And he said to me, "I'm Palestinian." And I said to him, "I'm Palestinian more than you because I was born in Israel, okay, at the time Palestine in 1943, okay?" And we had a long talk. The most interesting aspect of that conversation was, first, he wants to have a one-state solution. He does not want a two-state solution. And he does not want a Jewish state. I said, it's not for you to decide. The Jews want their own state, much like the Muslims have 50 states of Islamic states. Okay, the Jews are entitled to one Jewish state. Okay, and he said, oh, they're wrong. That the Islamic states are Islamic instead of what it's called would be democratic state. And then the other thing he said, and that was a total shock to me, he said, until 48, the Palestinians and the Jews lived happily ever after. It's only in 48 that the Jews expelled all these Palestinians where the conflict came to be. And I said, no, that's not how it came to be. It was a very interesting experience, okay? And I think Jewish Collaborative wants to say something.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that conversation with us. I think that's a really interesting conversation to have. Look, one of the reasons I approach this from a perspective of the multiple narratives, because I don't think that any one person's experience, Palestinian versus another Palestinian, captures all of it. And, even when I generalize about this is the Palestinian narrative, I'm mindful that there are multiple ways to see this. And the same thing with the Zionist, the Israeli narrative and the Egyptian narrative. But I am trying to make a point that a set of events happen and every actor that has a role in it has a different set of incentives and interests and perspectives and reactions to it, all of which feed the overarching reality of the way this thing has developed historically. And that's how we got to the point we are now. And that's, as a political scientist, what I'm interested in. So yes,
exactly.
Yaira, I would love to hear what you have to say, Yaira.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I was making. This guy is 30 years old, was born and raised in Ramallah.
Okay, hang on one second.
I didn't have anything to say.
I just wanted to finish, to respond to what you said, Scott. So the man was 30 years old. He was born and raised in Ramallah and only left Israel, the Palestinian Ramallah, only 6 years ago. In his mind, it's all the Jews. There was no conflict until 48. It is such a strange narrative that he gave me. I could not believe it. But I think your daughter wanted to give me an example of Israelis confiscating land in the West Bank. I'd love to hear about that.
No, I didn't have I didn't want to give you any examples.
Okay, that's my point. You'll never find
Because
one.
not because I don't have them, but I just didn't want to have that conversation right now.
Oh, okay, that's fine. But I'm saying is you'll be hard to find an example in which there won't be some shred of evidence that this land controversy of land was not really in dispute. It's not they just came and took a land from an owner. It's ridiculous. The whole world will be up in arms against it, especially the United States, especially Jews in the United States. Could not
Actually, I would disagree. I feel like a lot of Jews in the United States.
You'll have to provide me the example which sustains your position.
Okay.
Now,
I can talk about all the settlements in the West Bank. Here we go.
it's not the West Bank. It's on Jewish lands. It's not Palestinian. None of it belongs to the Palestinians except for the areas in which they sit, in which the area in which they dwell. When the Jews let's say to Hebron, they bought the houses from the Palestinians. What do you think? The Israelis just went and took over lands from owners? Ridiculous.
Yes.
That's exactly what they
No,
did.
they did that. a
No,
lot
they
of
did
time.
not.
That's
You
okay.
have to provide me a specific example. Absolutely not. Or else you should read the book that I recommended in the chat. Read the book in the chat. This was written by a guy who was born a Jew and a Catholic, and
Okay.
then became a Muslim, and he wrote a book after living in Israel for 10 years. He is a very impartial writer of the Wall Street Journal, and he'll tell you exactly what was going on.
Okay.
Okay, guys, listen. With those erudite words, unless somebody else has a beautiful question for me, I will sign off and I will see you next
I'd like to
Sunday.
say one more word, since we have the chance. Okay, in the chat, I talked about a woman called Wafa Sultan. You probably never heard of her. This woman was from Syria, and this relating to the comment that the Israelis complained about the